I have to tell you that our gospel lesson for today is one of my very favorite gospel lessons. I listened to this lesson for many years in church. It comes up at least every 3 years. And so, if you divide my age by three, it's a lot of times that I have heard this passage. And it's one of my favorites because I grew up not at all understanding that Jesus had a body. I grew up not understanding that God cares about human bodies. And this passage tells us very much that the resurrected Jesus is not a ghost, that the resurrected Jesus has flesh and bones, that Jesus is truly resurrected in his body. When we get to Ascension Day, we also will see that Jesus's entire body is taken up into heaven. It's not simply his soul that floats away into the sky, separate from his body. God cares about human bodies, and we see that in the person of Jesus. This is potentially why the disciples could not believe what they were seeing when they see Jesus in front of them. They watched Jesus die. They knew he was dead. They may have even helped carry him to the tomb and put him in there. Most of the disciples were locked away, hiding from the Roman authorities, lest they also be put to death. They are scared. And then all of a sudden, their teachers in front of them. It makes perfect sense to me that they would have trouble believing what they were seeing. For example, there was probably no category in their brains for resurrected. What kind of person is a resurrected person? What kind of person is an undead person? They certainly had boxes in their heads for ghosts because we know that they talk about ghosts. I know from working with youth group kids over the years that there are categories of undead having to do with zombies or vampires. They don't know if that was part of the mythology around the time that Jesus was there. I even recently learned that some people like to think about Jesus as a wizard who puts a piece of his soul into other things and then comes back into the body. And so there are all these categories of undead that people have in their brains. And certainly the disciples had categories of ghosts. Now, you all were not living 2,000 years ago in Palestine, in the area where Jesus was. So, let me tell you something important about that culture. It was a widely known, widely accepted fact that ghosts were unable to eat. Ghosts were unable to eat. And so the reason that Jesus says, touch my hands, is so they can feel him. The reason Jesus says, let's talk about all the stories we have shared together, so they can know that it really is Jesus and not somebody pretending to be Jesus. And the reason that Jesus asked for something to eat is to prove once and for all that he is not a ghost. We, as disciples of Jesus, are invited to take seriously that God cares about bodies, that God cares about all kinds of bodies. We are invited as disciples of Jesus to create new categories in our head. Those first disciples had to create a brand new category called resurrected for the breadth and depth of humanity in their heads when they met the resurrected Jesus. We are invited to not limit the categories that we have for people in our hands. We are invited to constantly create new categories, to constantly believe people's stories. Because you see, believing people's stories teaches us so much. Believing people's stories is what gives us access to the resurrected Jesus. Can you imagine what would have happened if the disciples had not believed Jesus? Can you imagine what would have happened if Jesus had not had a way to prove that he was flesh and bones and not really a ghost? What if the disciples had not believed Jesus was resurrected? After all, they probably had never met someone who was resurrected before. One of the things that would happen is we wouldn't all be here today, 2,000 years later. It was important that people believed that the body of Jesus, that the body of God on earth, was fully resurrected and alive again. That's what gives us access, it says at the end of this reading, to forgiveness of sin. And we get to proclaim forgiveness of sin in the name of Jesus. I know from personal experience and from reading this story that sometimes believing things and believing other people is really hard. I remember the first major events that I understood, the first major news event that I understood. News was not really talked about a lot in my house, but when I was 10, the Berlin Wall came down. And I remember being 10 years old and sitting and watching the nightly news with my parents and watching people chip away at the wall and watched people cheering. And I remember at the age of 10, it was the first time that it had ever occurred to me that there were people in other countries living other lives and that their stories, their life experiences would be very different than mine. Their hopes and their dreams would be different from mine. There were some kids there too, helping to chip away at the wall. It had never occurred to me before the age of 10 that there were other people in the world outside of my nice white suburban bubble who had vastly different experiences of life and the world than I did. I learned that at 10. I continued to learn that when I went to college and I took my first introduction to sociology class. In that class, my eyes were opened and I was taught about how the systems and the policies and the procedures and the laws that are in place in our world mean that some people have vastly different experiences of the world than I do. That my worldview, that my life experiences are not the only ones that matter. I was invited to learn how to believe other people's stories. But just like those early disciples, I didn't want to. Just like those early disciples, I wanted to say, oh, that's never happened to me. So that can't possibly be a real thing happening. Just like those early disciples, I wanted to say, wait, you're telling me this story and you're telling me that the world around you affects you in this way and that you have these life experiences that I don't. And I want to be like, nah, you're a ghost. That's not true. God, the image of God, does not reside in your body. The image of God only resides in my body and the people who live like me and the people who look like me and the people who understand the world like me. But then I read this Bible passage and I see how deeply Jesus cares about flesh and blood. I see how deeply Jesus cares about teaching people that he's not a ghost, he's a real live human. I see how deeply Jesus wants us to have other categories in our heads. There was something that I noticed this week. I read a story about people in Indianapolis, and I read a story about the person who perpetrated the violence in Indianapolis. And it was interesting that the whole entire story was about the mental health of the person who perpetrated the violence. I've read many, many, many other news stories this week. The news has been truly awful this week for people who are transgender. The news has been truly awful this week for people who are Black. The news has been truly awful this week for people of Asian descent. There is a lot of violence in the world. There have been multiple shootings in Chicago this week as well, and in the last 5 weeks. What I noticed is that in this article about the person who perpetrated the violence in Indiana, it's all about mental health. And yet, when we look at the stories of Dante Wright or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or all of the others, what we read in these stories is, or Adam Toledo in Chicago, what we read in these stories are people who have vastly different experiences of the world. We read about a 13-year-old kid named Adam in Chicago, 13 years old, who complies with police orders, has his hands up, and is killed by the police anyway. Where I live, that's not something I have to worry about. Where I live, I don't have to worry about my son at 13 being killed by the police, even if he complies with orders. I don't have to worry about him being shot at the age of 20 with a child just because of a traffic stop or having expired tags. And I have to tell you, I don't want to deal with any of this. I want to say, no, those people and their stories, they don't matter. Those people are ghosts to me. Their worldview, their stories, their experiences of encountering the systems in the world, they're not my experiences. Everything is fine for me, so it should be totally fine for them. And then I look at the gospel reading. I look at the place where Jesus says, no, I'm real. I'm not a ghost. I have flesh and blood. And I think, oh, maybe Jesus is inviting me. Maybe Jesus is inviting me to see the flesh and the blood of other people. Maybe Jesus is inviting me to open up more categories in my brain for the experiences of other people and their stories. Maybe Jesus is inviting me to take seriously all people as children of God, to take seriously all bodies in the world and how they are treated by the world and by the systems around them. Maybe Jesus is inviting me, as Miss Ann said, out of my comfort zone to truly believe the stories of other people, even when I don't want to, even when it's hard, even when it feels threatening to me and my worldview, when I listen to those stories. Because being resurrected threatened the disciples' worldview. They didn't have a category for resurrected. They certainly didn't have a category for the way that resurrected people offer us forgiveness of sins. They could have not believed in the resurrection. We could not believe the stories of others who have lives very different from us. And yet, when we believe the story of Jesus's resurrection, when we believe that he was really flesh and skin and bones, when we believe in the category of resurrected, when we believe the stories of the other people around us who are equally made in the image of God and who are equally children of God and equally deserve to be alive, then we get to live out the resurrection story. We get to ask for forgiveness for the ways that we have treated other people and their stories as ghost-like. We get to feel and experience the incredible forgiveness of Jesus and the chance for new life and the chance to try again. We get to align ourselves with the disciples who are like, oh, nah, Jesus, you're just a ghost. You're not really here. You're not really flesh and blood. You're not really resurrected. We get to, like those disciples, be invited to change our worldview, to change our perspective. Because when we trust other people and their stories, when we believe them, when we believe children of God who are the flesh and the bones that Jesus cares so deeply about, that he got it twice, right? Jesus gets flesh and bones at Christmas and gets flesh and bones again in the resurrection. When we take seriously this care for flesh and bones, when we take seriously the believing of other people's stories, not only does our entire world open up, not only do we get the peace, the abiding peace of a Jesus who forgives us and gives us the chance to try again, we get to be part of the people, part of the disciples who are so committed to the resurrected Jesus who wants life for everyone, that we get to be part of making that happen in the world around us. We get to be part of sharing that peace. We get to be part of saying to other people, I believe you. I believe that your life could be vastly different from mine. I believe that your story could be vastly different from mine. And I believe that you are a valuable child of God. I believe that you are flesh and bone and that you matter and that your story matters. I believe that you are worth maybe stepping out of my comfort zone so that I can share peace with you, so that I can share systemic change with you, so that I can fight for your right to be alive and have your basic human needs met along with mine. When we truly believe in the resurrection of Jesus, we get a deep and abiding peace in our own lives. We get forgiveness in our own lives. And then, if we truly believe, we get the power to share that incredible peace and joy with the world around us and the ways that we work for all people's flesh and bones to be valuable. Thanks be to Jesus, who came back as resurrected, who isn't a ghost, who forces us to make new categories so that we can have the peace, that we are doing everything we can to share that unconditional love with everyone around us. Amen.